For today's Bible reading, I would like to read in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 4, verse 4. But he answered, that is Jesus, "It is written, man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God." It's interesting to see the setting under which this word came. Jesus was tempted for about 40 days and 40 nights. He didn't eat anything. And he was tempted by the devil, by Satan. He was the accuser of the brethren. He was the tempter, wanting him to shift away from what God said and from the purposes that God had for him, and to seek fulfillment in his soul and in his body in other things than what God had intended. Look what it says in verse 3 when the tempter tempted him. He says, "If you are the Son of God, command these stones to become loaves of bread." Now, according to the context, we can see that Jesus was hungry. He had a need to eat. I don't know whether you've ever fasted for 40 days, but my wife and I went on a juice fast for 57 days years ago. And it was a good experience for us. But when you start fasting, particularly, you become quite hungry in the beginning. And here, Jesus is about 40 days. They say that if you fast just on water for 40 days, eventually, at the end of those days, you start becoming very hungry. So I can imagine that Jesus was really hungry when Satan came to him and tempted him, saying, you know, if you are the Son of God, let's prove it. Make these stones, make these rocks to become bread so you can eat, so you can satisfy your physical need. And I'm sure that Satan comes to many of us in various forms, tempting us, wanting us to satisfy our physical needs in other ways than the way God intended it. You know, there are so many people who struggle in their marriages, for example. Husbands and wives, particularly in the beginning years when they're married, they kind of have to mesh together, to learn to appreciate the differences, to accept the other person rather than trying to change them. And because things don't work as well at that time, there are more conflicts, there is more tension. We sometimes develop an idea that our spouse that we married is not the person that we really married. And as a result, there might come a temptation in our hearts to seek for another relationship outside of our marriage. And we think, oh, if my spouse was like this other person, and we start seeing positive things in the other person, and eventually commit adultery, either in our hearts or in real. Trying to satisfy our inner need for love and acceptance. Now, that would be a wrong thing to do. Jesus says here that man does not live by bread alone, not by that thing that satisfies us physically alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God. Maybe another temptation might be, you know, you're married and you have children, or even if you're not married and you don't have children, but you're single, and you see how life is very expensive. It costs a lot of money to feed yourself, to clothe yourself, to drive a car, to live in a home, and do some other things. And it costs a lot of money. And as you look at your paycheck, sometimes you think, oh, I wish I had a higher pay, or I wish I had a higher position. And maybe as a result of that, you don't look for the opportunities to advance yourself in a proper way. You use others as a stepping stone to go ahead. You don't help them go ahead, you just want to go ahead. Or you might be lying, you might be stealing, or all kinds of things with the thought that you're going to have more in your life. But you're never going to advance by putting others down. You might for a moment, but eventually you're going to lose. You're going to experience the wrath of your own medicine. That is never going to satisfy you. Having more things, having more money, even a bigger house, a nicer car, or traveling more, does not really satisfy us deeply within our own soul, within our own spirit. Nothing from the physical realm can satisfy what we need on an emotional level. Nothing from the physical realm can satisfy us what we need on a spiritual level. That's why Jesus says the full, complete satisfaction really comes from the Word of God. Here he says, but by every word in the original Greek means rhema that comes from the mouth of God. Rhema really is a spoken word. Every spoken word is what can satisfy us. We don't live our lives just because we have good things in our lives, but because we have the Word of God, he says. We need the Word of God to experience fullness of satisfaction and joy and life in our human existence. That's what will satisfy us. If we try to satisfy that spiritual need by food, for example, all we are going to do is just gain weight. If we're going to satisfy that need with money, all we are going to do is just worry about money. The more we have, the more mouths we feed, the more we spend, and it doesn't really completely satisfy us. If we're trying to satisfy our spiritual need by going to other men and women, having a relationship with them, it won't satisfy us either. It is going to bring, actually, according to the book of Proverbs, we read that if we go to another woman, we are going to go to poverty, sickness, and death. So the only really deep satisfaction comes from the Word of God. That's how we are going to live. The Word that is spoken. So in order to hear it, we need to read it aloud to ourselves or quote it. Or maybe hear it on television or on radio or maybe on a CD, maybe in the church or in a Bible study group, wherever. It's important to hear the Word of God so that there will be a ringing in our ears, a constant reminder of what God says in His Word, because that is the only thing, the Word of God is the only thing that will really feed our inner spirit and our person, who God made us to be. That's why it is so important to have daily devoted periods of time when we go alone and read the Word of God. Meditate upon its truth and quote it to ourselves, quote it to the angels, quote to our spouse, quote to our children, quote to other people, quote to ourselves, as I said, so that we can hear the Word of God. It is going to feed our soul. So when we have to make a decision how to relate to our spouse, we then look, what does the Word of God say? How to go ahead in our lives, then we look at the Word, what does the Word of God say? Then as we learn how to relate to our children, we are asking ourselves, what does the Word of God say? And then based on what the Word of God says, that's what we are going to speak, that's how we are going to act, and that's how we are going to live our lives. That's how we are going to be satisfied. That's the only thing that can feed our spirit, that can feed our soul and ourselves. Do not look for satisfaction somewhere else. It will never completely satisfy. It might provide you temporary joys, but if it is illegal or immoral, it will be very bitter. But take the Word of God. Take the Word of God every day. Feed your soul, feed your spirit, meditate upon that truth, and then live it and speak it so you can hear it. And as you hear the Word of God, it's going to bring life to you. It's going to bring healing to you. It's going to guide you and direct you in the paths that you should go. It's going to really give you completeness of life. Nothing else will satisfy. Do not listen to the tempter who wants to take your time away from God, who wants to misdirect you to act and to speak contrary to what God says in His Word, because it will never satisfy you. The only food for your soul and for your life comes from the Word of God. So read the Word today. Take advantage of it. That is the best part of your life. Like Jesus said about Mary. Mary has chosen a better part because she sat at His feet, listening, hearing the Word of God. Be the person who will do likewise.